How can 50,000 soldiers just up and disappear?
Hush, little baby, don't say a word.
This is a conspiracy channel.
Welcome to the Hush channel. The lost army of Cambyses is one of the oldest and most enduring mysteries of the ancient world, a story that sits at the intersection of recorded history, legend, and unexplained disappearance. In a region already haunted by stories of things swallowed by the desert, from the lost oasis of Zerzura to later quests for the vanished army of Cambyses that even Laszlo Almasi hoped to continue searching for after World War II, Siwa stood at the center of a much larger geography of rumor, sacred power, and disappearance. According to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, around 525 BC, a massive Persian force of approximately 50,000 soldiers vanished without a trace in the western desert of Egypt. This army had been sent by Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus the Great and ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, during his campaign to conquer Egypt. At the time, Cambyses had successfully taken control of Egypt and sought to consolidate his power. This conquest itself was not a minor campaign, but part of a larger expansion of the Achaemenid Empire, which under Cyrus the Great had already become the largest empire the world had seen up to that point, stretching from Anatolia to Central Asia. When Cambyses turned toward Egypt, he was moving against one of the last major independent powers in the ancient Near East. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Pelusium, where Persian forces defeated the Egyptian army, securing control over the Nile Delta and opening the way for Persian rule over Egypt. With Egypt now under his control, Cambyses' focus shifted from conquest to control, eliminating any remaining centers of resistance, influence, or competing authority within the region. One of the final threats to his authority was the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, a remote and highly revered religious center in the Libyan desert. Siwa was not some minor outpost, but one of the most isolated and symbolically powerful oasis settlements in Egypt, lying deep in the western desert between the Qattara Depression and the Great Sand Sea, about 50 kilometers east of the Libya border and roughly 560 kilometers from Cairo. The oasis sits in a natural depression below sea level and is made fertile by artesian waters and irrigation, with about 200 spring-sustaining palms, olives, and settled life in the middle of an otherwise punishing desert. In antiquity, it was famed as the Oasis of Amun-Ra, and the ancient Egyptian name, often translated as Field of Trees, captures exactly how astonishing such a place would have looked against the surrounding stone and sand. Siwa also mattered because it was never only a landscape. It was a living cultural world, historically inhabited by the people now known as the Siwi Berbers, or Isiwan, an Amazigh community whose oasis is still recognized as Egypt's easternmost Berber-speaking enclave. Their language, Siwi, preserves that distinct identity, and the oasis' long isolation helped maintain both its local culture and its aura of remoteness. That isolation is part of why Siwa appears so often in stories of the lost, the hidden, and the hard to reach. It stood on the edge of the known world for Nile-centered states and for outside travelers, surrounded by vast desert barriers that made it feel less like a normal settlement and more like a place apart. In antiquity, that isolation only heightened the prestige of its sanctuary. The Oracle of Amun, centered near Al-Qurmi, was believed to transmit the will of the god Amun through priestly interpretation. Amun was already one of the supreme gods of Egypt, and in the Greek world he was identified with Zeus Ammon, which gave the sanctuary authority across Egyptian, Libyan, and Greek cultural spheres. That mattered enormously, because an oracle in the ancient world was not simply a shrine where people prayed. It was a place where divine approval, kingship, warfare, legitimacy, and destiny could all be pronounced. A ruler recognized by such a sanctuary could claim not merely victory, but sacred sanction. To understand how this actually functioned, one of the clearest examples comes from Alexander the Great, who journeyed to Siwa in 331 BC after conquering Egypt. His route itself was dangerous, crossing the same desert corridors that had already swallowed armies and caravans before him. Ancient accounts describe how he and his men struggled through the terrain, at times relying on guides, at times said to have followed birds or been aided by sudden rains, details that reflect just how unpredictable and deadly the journey to Siwa could be. When Alexander finally arrived at the Temple of Amun, he did not simply observe or worship. He consulted the oracle. Inside the sanctuary, the process was not a direct conversation with a god, but an interpreted ritual. Priests of Amun would carry or stand before the sacred image of the deity and respond to questions posed by the ruler, often in ways that could be interpreted symbolically. According to the accounts preserved by his historians, Alexander was greeted not as a foreign invader, but as the son of Amun himself. Whether this was a formal declaration or a phrase interpreted to mean such, the result was the same. Alexander left Siwa with divine validation of his rule. That moment was not just spiritual, it was political. By being recognized by the oracle, Alexander could present himself not only as a conqueror of Egypt, but as its rightful, divinely sanctioned Pharaoh. This is why the oracle was not just spiritual but political, as it held influence over local populations and legitimacy among rulers. Leaders and envoys crossed dangerous desert routes to consult it before major decisions, believing the god's voice could shape military campaigns and royal destiny. Its prestige was so widely acknowledged that centuries later, Alexander the Great deliberately traveled there after entering Egypt. An ancient tradition held that the priests recognized him in terms that reinforced his divine and pharaonic legitimacy. Whether every detail of that episode is historical or embellished, the political meaning is unmistakable. Siwa was a place where religion could authorize rule. For a conquering foreign king like Cambyses, that made the oracle more than a temple. It was a rival source of power, symbolism, and loyalty outside Persian control. According to historical accounts, Cambyses ordered an army to march westward from Thebes across the desert to subdue the oracle and bring the region under Persian control. This was not a small scouting party, but a large organized military force, likely composed of infantry, support personnel, guides, and supply carriers, moving across one of the most dangerous environments on Earth with limited water access and no permanent roadways. In doing so, he was not merely targeting a remote temple, but attempting to eliminate a symbolic and political center that could challenge his authority and inspire opposition. Herodotus provides the only surviving detailed account of what happened next. He states that the army successfully reached an intermediate oasis, identified by many scholars as the Karga or Dakhla oasis, after approximately a 7-day march across the desert. From there, they continued westward towards Siwa. However, somewhere midway between this oasis and their destination, the army stopped to rest and eat. It was at this moment, according to Herodotus, that a powerful and catastrophic south wind arose. The storm intensified rapidly, carrying massive amounts of sand across the desert. The force of the wind and sand was so great that it completely engulfed the army, burying all 50,000 men beneath the sand. Herodotus writes that they disappeared from sight, and from that point forward, no survivors returned, and no confirmed trace of the army was ever found. This account, preserved in the History's Book 3.26, has remained the foundation of the legend for over 2,000 years. However, it is important to note that Herodotus himself was not an eyewitness. His information came from secondhand reports, specifically from Egyptian sources and the people of the Siwa region, referred to as the Ammonians. According to these local accounts, the army never reached Siwa, and its fate was only known through what was said to have happened in the desert. Because of this, historians have long debated whether the story is literal or symbolic. Many Egyptologists consider the account apocryphal, suggesting that it may have been exaggerated or constructed to explain a military failure that was never properly recorded. Others argue that while the details may be embellished, the disappearance itself could be rooted in a real event, one shaped by the extreme and often deadly conditions of the Sahara. What makes this story particularly compelling is not just the scale of the disappearance, but the environment in which it allegedly occurred. The western desert of Egypt is one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Sandstorms can arise suddenly and reduce visibility to near zero within minutes. Winds can lift and drive huge quantities of sand across open ground, erasing tracks almost immediately. Combined with dehydration, disorientation, distance between water sources, and the lack of stable landmarks, it is entirely possible for large groups to become scattered, buried, or simply lost beyond recovery. That same desert logic is part of why places like Zerzura remain so compelling in the first place. In this region, the line between geography and legend has always been thin. Rather than closing the question, this is where the mystery begins, because despite centuries of speculation, no confirmed trace of the army has ever been found, leaving open the possibility that what happened in that desert was either far more complex than a single storm, or that the sands of the Sahara are still holding on to something that has yet to be uncovered. Despite the account given by Herodotus, the disappearance of the army has never been definitively explained, and over time, multiple investigations have attempted to locate physical evidence of what happened in the western desert, yet none have produced a confirmed answer. The earliest modern searches were driven by the same logic that guided the explorers of Zerzura. If the army truly existed, then something of it, bones, weapons, camps, or burial remains, should still be recoverable somewhere between the Nile oases and Siwa. One of the most notable early figures connected to this search was Laszlo Almasi, who, after mapping large portions of the Libyan desert, became deeply interested in locating the lost army described by Herodotus. His work in the 1930s, particularly around the Gilf Kabir and Great Sand Sea regions, helped establish the geographic reality of how difficult such a search would be. But like his search for Zerzura, it yielded no direct evidence of the army itself. In 1933, British officer Ordie Wingate also attempted to locate traces of the army while operating in the Libyan desert. His search, like others of the time, relied heavily on surface observation and limited mapping data, and ultimately ended without results. These early efforts established a pattern that would continue into the modern era: strong interest, difficult terrain, and no confirmation. A much more structured attempt came decades later, between 1983 and 1984, when American journalist and researcher Gary S. Chaffetz led a large-scale expedition supported by Harvard University, the National Geographic Society, and Egyptian geological authorities. This expedition focused on a specific search zone along the Egypt-Libya border, covering approximately 100 square kilometers of dense dune fields southwest of the Bahariya oasis. Unlike earlier explorers, Chaffetz's team used modern tools, including ground-penetrating radar, aerial reconnaissance, and geological surveying. During this expedition, the team discovered approximately 500 tumuli, burial mounds, along with fragments of bone. At first, this seemed promising, as it suggested the presence of human remains in a region consistent with the army's supposed route. However, further testing using thermoluminescence dating revealed that the remains were approximately 1,000 years older than the time of Cambyses, placing them around 1500 BC. This effectively ruled them out as belonging to the lost Persian army. The expedition also uncovered a carved winged sphinx in a nearby cave, which appeared to have Persian stylistic elements, but again, no direct connection to the missing army could be confirmed. In the early 2000s, another potential breakthrough emerged when a geological team from Helwan University reported discovering fragments of textiles, metal objects resembling weapons, and human remains in Egypt's western desert. I want to go back to this part here briefly where I said, it is important to note that Herodotus himself was not an eyewitness. His information came from secondhand reports, specifically from Egyptian sources and the people of the Siwa region, referred to as the Ammonians. I have a theory, unrelated to the topic. So, the people Herodotus called the Ammonians were the inhabitants of Siwa Oasis in Egypt's western desert, named after the god Amun, a central Egyptian deity associated with kingship, hidden power, and divine authority, later identified by the Greeks as Zeus Ammon. In the Bible, Ammon is both a person and the origin of a people. According to Genesis, Ben-Ami, meaning son of my people, was born to Lot and his daughter after she raped him following Sodom and Gomorrah's situation. His biblical name for us is Ammon, and Ammon became the forefather of the Ammonites, a nation that settled east of the Jordan River in the region of modern-day Jordan. The Ammonites are presented as a distinct people with their own lineage, territory, and identity, existing alongside other nations of the ancient Near East within a broader world that was already interconnected through movement, expansion, and long-standing human presence across North Africa and the Levant. Following that pattern, the connection between Amun, the Ammonians, and Ammon can be understood as part of a deeper continuity rather than coincidence. As populations spread, separated, and reformed over long periods of time, names, identities, and belief systems evolved with them, often preserving older roots in altered forms. The shared naming distinction between Amun and Ammon reflects that kind of continuity, pointing back to a time before these identities were fully separated into what later became Egyptian religious tradition on one side and biblical nations on the other. In that sense, these groups can be viewed as emerging from the same broader cultural and ancestral world, shaped by migration, environmental change, and the gradual formation of distinct societies, while still carrying traces of a common origin in their names and remembered identities. Now back to the topic. More recently, a different theory has emerged that shifts away from environmental explanations entirely. Dutch Egyptologist Olaf Kapir proposed that the army may not have been lost to a sandstorm at all, but instead ambushed and destroyed by forces loyal to an Egyptian rebel leader, often identified as Petubastis III. According to this theory, the army could have been deliberately led into hostile terrain and eliminated, with the sandstorm story later created or exaggerated to obscure a military defeat and erase the memory of resistance against Persian rule. But there is another layer to this, one that does not attempt to prove what happened, but instead asks how events like this survive in memory at all. When looking at the geography, something becomes immediately clear. The region where Cambyses' army vanished is the exact same corridor where the legend of Zerzura is consistently placed. The western desert between Siwa, Dakhla, Kufra, the Gilf Kabir Plateau, and the Great Sand Sea is not just vast. It is one of the most difficult environments on Earth to fully map, navigate, or permanently document. Hidden wadis, enclosed valleys, and isolated water systems exist within it, places that can sustain life, yet remain completely invisible unless approached from the correct direction. However, when the timelines are examined, a gap appears. The disappearance of Cambyses' army is placed around 525 BC, while Zerzura does not appear in written sources until well over 1,000 years later, emerging in medieval Arabic texts such as the Kitab al-Kunuz in the 15th century. There is no direct historical record linking the two, no continuity that confirms Zerzura as a known settlement from the Persian period. And yet, the overlap in location remains exact. This is where a different kind of possibility emerges, not as a confirmed fact, but as a theory rooted in how the desert behaves. If Cambyses' army was not entirely destroyed, if even a fraction of that force survived, became separated, or found refuge within a hidden valley or oasis, then it is possible that small groups could have settled in isolation. Over time, such a group would lose its original identity, its language would shift, and its customs would change. Generations later, what remained would no longer resemble a Persian army, but a separate people, isolated, altered, and unfamiliar to outsiders. Descriptions of Zerzura begin to echo this kind of transformation. Accounts describe inhabitants who spoke a strange form of Arabic, who did not follow expected religious practices, and who possessed features and customs that seemed out of place within the surrounding regions. Some accounts even describe fair-skinned inhabitants and foreign-style weapons, details that have led some to speculate about outside origins, though none have been confirmed. At the same time, Zerzura is also described through clearly symbolic and mythological elements: white cities, hidden treasure, sleeping rulers, and magical instructions involving carved birds and hidden keys. These are not characteristics of a known Persian military settlement, but rather motifs common in medieval Arabic treasure traditions. So what emerges is not a clean historical connection, but something more complex. Rather than Zerzura being directly founded by Cambyses' lost army, it may instead represent something else entirely, a preserved memory of disappearance. In a landscape where entire groups can vanish without a trace, where geography itself can erase events, stories do not always survive as history. Sometimes they survive as legend, and in that sense, Zerzura and the lost army of Cambyses may not be the same story, but they may be born from the same reality, a desert where things do not just get lost, but are removed from history altogether. And when all of this is laid out, every expedition, every failed search, every fragment that leads nowhere, it stops looking like a single mystery and starts looking like a pattern. The same desert that may have swallowed the army of Cambyses is the same desert that hides Zerzura, the same terrain that revealed entire lost valleys like Gilf Kebir only within the last century, and the same landscape that continues to shift bury, and erase anything that enters it unprepared. In a place like this, history does not always survive as record. It survives as rumor, as fragments, as stories that sound too strange to be real. So the question is no longer just what happened to one lost army, but how many events like it have already been removed from history entirely, leaving behind nothing but legend. Whatever happened, there is no way 50,000 people just up and died like that without any survivors. Or maybe they did. What do you think?